As we continue our journey around the world during this third act of the Global Landscapes Forum Digital Edition, it is my pleasure to introduce our next discussion forum, coming live from Nairobi, hosted by UN Environment. The recently announced UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is building momentum to address the climate biodiversity crisis at massive scale, over a decade and beyond. So we have high hopes for this discussion forum to provide us with much needed inspiration and a strong starting point. For those of you joining online, don't forget to submit questions and comments via the live stream chat box or via social media using the hashtags thinklandscape and GLF Kyoto 2019. We now welcome moderator Masunda Mumba and wish you all a lively discussion. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Hello. Hello. Is this the after lunch challenge? Well, good afternoon. We are live and streaming from Nairobi, Kenya. This is the GLF, Global Landscape Forum, Kyoto, but actually streaming out of Nairobi, Kenya from the UN Environment. My name is Masunda Mumba, and I lead the Terrestrial Ecosystems Unit of UN Environment. And this afternoon, we have a fantastic audience here in Nairobi and amazing panelists over here who I will introduce very shortly. But I want to begin by saying the last few months have been very interesting. October, we got the report, the 1.5 degree report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Not so very long, beginning of the year, we had the Global Environment Outlook. And not so very long, last week, we had the biodiversity report, the global assessment on biological diversity and the status of biological diversity in the world. And I think the picture that has emerged is very much that the planet, as it is and as we know it, this place we call home, has changed, very much degraded. Implications for our health, for our very well-being, and how we exist and how we survive and live on this planet. So today, without further ado, we're going to be looking at the whole issue of restoration. How do we restore this very well-being and this very existence and these very landscapes that we very much depend on? So this particular session is going to be split into two. The first part of the session is really looking at the whole global element and the dynamic and really getting an understanding from a much broader sort of helicopter view on where we are at. At the very end, at the very beginning of this table, I have the Director General of ECRAF, Tony Simons, Dr. Tony Simons. Thank you, welcome. And in the middle, I have Ms. Elsie Atafoa, who is the current UNDP Africa Forest and Climate Technical Advisor, transitioning and moving next week to Uganda as the new resident rep of Uganda of UNDP. And right, last but not the least, of course, I have our Acting Executive Director, Joyce Msuya for UN Environment here. Welcome. So we're very, very excited. So without further ado, I would like to pass on to Ms. Msuya to just give us some opening remarks and really just contextualize where we are at, even as an agency, and why we're looking at this very important topic, because our agency has also been instrumental in actually providing leadership in these very important reports that have been shared globally. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Musonda. I'm really delighted to be here, especially on a Monday afternoon. So I will be short and crisp so we can get going. But let me first recognize Tony Simons, the Director General of ECRAF, and Elsie Atafoa, who is currently with UNDP RED, and just about to turn over the chapter to something more exciting, I'm assuming. And distinguished guests, UN colleagues and partners. I think first I have to thank the team that has organized this, and especially doing it digitally. I think you're setting a very good example, Musonda, when you're talking about carbon footprint and how we should not travel when we don't have to, and we promise to follow your lead as much as we can. But I also very delighted to welcome you all to this discussion forum on the restoration opportunities in East Africa. As some of you know, in March 2019, the UN General Assembly took a historic decision to declare the next decade the UN Decade on Ecosystems Restoration. This is not a small achievement. It's actually a significant recognition of the reality facing us today, that whilst ecosystems have been the foundation of our economic growth, we have systematically destroyed the wealth that makes human life on this planet possible. And science has sounded a red alert, as Musonda alluded to. For example, last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services warned us that 75% of Earth's land is already degraded, 75%. According to the report issued just last week by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, 50% of agricultural expansion has occurred at the expense of forests, and we have witnessed a 75% reduction in mangrove cover around the world. The data on marine fish stocks is equally alarming. 33% of marine fish stocks have been harvested at unsustainable levels, and more than 50% of live coral reef cover has been lost since the 1870s. So this workshop and what we are going to do over the next decade really is timely. The UN Decade on Ecosystems Restoration could not have come at a much, much more critical juncture. We here at the UN Environment Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization are honored to lead the implementation of this decade along with partners from around the world. I see 4 major opportunities for us. One, we need to demonstrate that ecosystems restoration is key strategy to address climate change. Natural carbon sinks such as forest and landscape sequester more than half of the amount of CO2 humans emit into the atmosphere. Nature-based solutions are our best answer to the climate challenge. And I'm particularly excited about the September Secretary General Summit on climate change, where UN Environment Programme has been asked to lead on nature-based solutions, together with 2 co-sponsor countries, China and New Zealand, working with the rest of our UN sisters and brothers, but also the CBD Biodiversity Convention based in Montreal. 2, opportunity, the second one, is we need to push for greater financing. Only 3% of the public climate finance investments are currently channeled into agriculture, forestry, land use, and natural resource management. I think we can all agree this is way too little given the daunting challenges we have. 3, we need to showcase the incredible opportunities that we create when we restore ecosystems. The International Union for Conservation of Nature estimates that restoring 350 million hectares of degraded land by 2030 will produce $9 trillion worth of ecosystems benefits. Restoring nature is as much a tool of economic empowerment as any other strategy economists will place before us. By 1987, Costa Rica's tropical forest cover had declined from 87% at the start of the century to below 30%. Yet through a series of remarkable restoration efforts, the country's forest cover increased to 50% in 2010. And with it came numerous spin-off benefits for the environment, economy, citizens, and communities. And I think we can build on these examples, such as the Costa Rica, to actually scale up what works well and learn from each other. Another example is South Korea. I used to live in South Korea at some point in my life, and even as the country's population doubled between 1953 and 2007, the country expanded forest cover from 35 to 64%. And this was also the time when Korea's economic growth was also growing very, very fast. I think the message from South Korea, again, is economic development and taking care of our forests are not mutually exclusive. And finally, we cannot ignore the central role of indigenous and local communities in building the future we want. The IPBES report on the unprecedented decline of nature is an incredibly comprehensive document of many hundred pages. But one of my key takeaways messages is that the decline of our ecosystems has been less severe in areas held or managed by indigenous people and local communities. They have to be and they must be central to any strategy to restore our ecosystem. So as we launch this decade, an important one, and I look forward to being a part of it, let us create a global call for action that combines political will, the best of science, a business as unusual approach by corporations and citizen engagement to make this decade the success it must be. Our children and the youth are watching what we can do and we will not do. And I think we owe it to them to deliver. Because our future on this planet, quite simply, depends on it. Asanteni sana. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you very much for that intervention. I think you really highlight a very critical element on the power of community and also the importance of indigenous communities who have really been the custodians of the very ecosystems that we depend on. I want to turn to you, Dr. Simons. You have been the head of ECRAF, the World Agroforestry Center, for many years, and I would imagine that your experience of having worked not just on the African continent but globally has been actually really, really wonderful. And we would like to hear from you in terms of how is it that your organization has been part of this journey to also be part of a solution to the restoration conversation.
Thanks very much, Ms. Sondra, and thank you very much, Joyce, for great words to kick us off today. Wow, here we are in Nairobi in our virtual meeting and our virtual travel to Kyoto. But like air travel, we probably all have a bit of baggage we could lose. And the baggage that we've got to lose is the way we manage our planet. And the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, we've been privileged to be hosted by 34 countries around the world for the last 40 years, working on some of these global problems. We started out as an academic institute, and we brought into development, to policy, and now to delivery, combining the four elements together: research, delivery, policy, and development. So where we have been successful, it's due to working very closely with very broad partnerships, because one institution can't do it on its own. Like UNEP, we were a product of the Stockholm Earth Conference in 1972. And in 3 years' time, I've just come back from Sweden actually yesterday, in 3 years' time there's going to be a 50th anniversary of that, celebrating everything since the bad old days of 1972. And in 50 years' time, somebody's going to come back and celebrate the bad old days of 2022, when we didn't look after our planet, when we were doing things that were crazy. And you've heard both Joyce and Masonda talk about these global reports that have come out. You know, we were in Paris, we were hoping for a 1.5 degree world. Now we're kind of thinking, well, it's going to be at least 2. And how much, if it gets to a 3 degree world? Honestly, if it gets to a 4 degree world, we're going to end up with a 4-letter outcome for this planet. We really got to get serious about it and the way in which we manage it. So when we talk about landscapes and the Global Landscape Forum and its relationship to ecosystem restoration, it's about doing things in a connected way, doing things at a much larger scale. And I was speaking to a chap just before we started here. What's the worst form of restoration on our planet? It's probably open cast mining, and you have to restore it back. Now, the US is responsible for 55% of all open cast mining in the world, and very strong legislation to restore it, either to amenity or to wilderness areas. Very costly. It costs between $20,000 and $50,000 per hectare to restore open cast mining. So we're making all of these pledges. can anyone tell me to the nearest 10 million hectares over the last 50 years, given all of that legislation and support and finance, to the nearest 10 million hectares, how many hectares have been restored in the US? 1.2 million. So it's very easy for us to wave our hands and say, well, we'll have 10 over there and another 50 over there. Could we sign you up for 100 at the back? And we're great at committing and showing commitments, but we're not really very committed to delivering on them. And that's really what's got to change. And that's scientists as well. We would dangle a carrot of some wonderful solution in front of somebody, but it wouldn't be available, which is why we've got to help work at scale and deliver things. We are an institution that was founded in the 70s, and we have fortunately received, with C4, because we just merged from the 1st of January, we've received $1.8 billion investment in knowledge products. We have the Amazon warehouse of knowledge on forestry, landscapes, agroforestry, community use, etc., wood energy, whatever you want. It is the Amazon warehouse. And you walk in there, and it's just like seeing all of those automated things moving around, shifting stuff, the packaging. It's just vast. And then you remember you only came in there to buy a toaster. And you're a bit lost in all of this complexity. And it's the same thing when we come to knowledge and knowledge products. There's so much information, so many reports, that we've got to start mining those to get to the technical, the social, the policy solutions that individual farmers and countries and subnational governments want. So forests and wetlands are a nightmare for African governments. They're just, what do we do with them? We've got a $10,000 per hectare asset, and we get less than $100 a year from it. You know, we don't want to give land tenure to communities. What are we going to do with this? And the opportunity cost for conversion is always there. And there's not money to look after it. We've got to make a business case for restoration. And the only way to do that is to properly price these assets, because the land is asset rich, but with a poor annual return. So how do we transform that very valuable and rich asset into something that will generate returns to the land user, to the stewards, to the local communities, and to the government? Because governments make money off cropping areas and make money off tourism areas and mining areas and others. But on forestry and wetlands, those are the two orphans, if you like, the ones that get neglected and don't get the investment. So if we've degraded these landscapes down, and now we want to put money to get them back up to a state where the governments couldn't look after them to start with, that doesn't make much sense. We've got to be a business case for restoration. There has to be a driver, performance, value to the local communities. And that's where we need the economists at UNEP and UNDP and others to help us on what's that difference between price, cost and value. What are we measuring things at? And carbon is probably the most extreme in the world. Thank you. So carbon is the most variable element there is. Okay? At the low end, it's $50 a ton as firewood. And at the high end, it's $100 billion a ton as diamonds. No. Mark's got a diamond on. He's wearing a diamond. Diamond earring, I think, yeah. So there's a range, $60 to $100 billion. Now, we were unhappy with that range, and we said, why don't we go for a lower end of $5 a ton and just call it atmospheric carbon? I mean, we know that a barrel of oil has 160 liters in it. We know it has a specific gravity of 85%. We know the carbon content is 85%. So can you imagine going to Vladimir Putin or the Saudi oil princes and saying, wow, have we got a deal for you? Listen to this, Joyce, please sign up for this. If you dig the oil out of the ground, okay, and stick it in a barrel and refine it and keep it for 100 years in a warehouse, we'll pay you 84 cents a barrel. Okay? 84 cents. Now, well, actually, you're not going to get all of the 84 cents because we've got some monitoring and verification and reporting, but we'll try and give you as much as we can, maybe up to 60 cents a barrel. Of course, they're not going to do it. And we shouldn't be doing the same for forests because we're not valuing them at their true value and is not a remunerative return. It's great if it's a trigger, a catalyst to plant the mango seedlings, to get the cashew growing, to work on whatever the tree crops, the energy or whatever that people need. But we're only going to do that when we lose some of that baggage on this virtual conference that we're on. So I'm hoping through the questions in the audience that you'll be able to provoke us as well to make sure that we're a bit disrupted, we're a bit outside of our comfortable space, because none of us, no institutions have been doing a brilliant job so far at trying to tackle this huge problem.
Well, thank you, Tony. And I just want to tell the audience, and thank you so much for that very provocative intervention. I just want to tell the audience out there in the world, anybody who's watching live, please, we're taking questions. And people sitting here in Nairobi, we're going to be taking questions for the panel. And so moving on swiftly, Ms. Atafoa, you have been working extensively across Africa, around the world, and really seeing real action on the ground. And I think Dr. Simmons really just brings us to that. Say, well, I saw you kind of, chuckling away with the carbon costing, the diamond costing. We forget that actually diamonds are carbon. And we would like to hear from you. In your work, how have you seen these transitions, and how are you, a UN development program, really looking to find solutions around the forest and climate synergy?
Well, thank you very much, Musonda, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and by extension, UNDP, to this event. And let me recognize your leadership, Joyce, and advancing this course and the UN Decade on Restoration. I mean, it's fantastic and excellent work. Congratulations on that, yeah. Let me try to put our discussions in context first, and let me try to look at the context from a global point of view and a regional point of view, if I may, before I come to the experiences and the work of UNDP in Africa, and perhaps conclude with some key messages moving forward. The starting point for the discussions on restoration is the Sustainable Development Goals. It's very key. And I think we know it by heart, but it's important for me to underscore that a bit more. I mean, all the SDGs are universal, indivisible. And if you look at SDG 13, 15, 17, name them, those on decent work, employment, gender, they all, one way or the other, link to the restoration agenda. Now, the SDG focuses on leaving no one behind. The question is, what does it mean to the African? Leaving no one behind, and saying that we need to reach the furthest first. And it's important that as we dialogue and have conversations around this, we'll link it to the bigger picture of the Sustainable Development Goals and what it means for us in Africa. Now, dovetailing now into the African context, we know our people depend on restoration. We depend on land, our agriculture, energy, tourism, water. Everything else is connected to the agenda of restoration, and we cannot decouple that, okay? So the rural farmer there depends on the land and how fertile the land is. So if there is degradation, there is deforestation, it has an impact, okay? So we have great opportunity here. Our continent relies on this restoration agenda, but we have a challenge. The challenge is that we have huge deforestation in many parts of our region, despite the fact that we've made great progress. We have degradation, and the question is, what can we do about it? Because that's important, that's connected to the livelihoods, and we cannot move that agenda without looking at restoration. Now, with that sort of setting that context, what has UNDP been doing? And it's important that the UNDP's agenda is also looked at within the three development settings that we have been focusing on. One is, how do we support countries to eradicate poverty? And that poverty, again, we cannot decouple that from the restoration agenda. The second one is on helping countries to really get into structural transformation. I'm going to give you a bit of examples to really put some meat on the bone as we move forward on the work that UNDP has been doing together with other partners. And the third, in terms of context for UNDP, is how do we help countries to be resilient to shocks and crises? I mean, today we have cyclones in Mozambique, we have drought here in Kenya. It's all about, one way or the other, by extension, issues to do with restoration and ecosystem degradation, okay? So when the droughts hit here, it might as well be as a result of the things that has been undermining the ecosystem for some time now. And the way we have tried to do it as UNDP, and again, this is not something, I like what you said, Simon, you can't do it alone. I think there's an African proverb which says that if you want to go alone, you can go fast. But if you want to go further, you go as a team. What have we been doing as UNDP? One of the things we've been doing is to look at really integrated policy and programming solutions to the issues that we're talking about. Most of the time when we're looking at forestry issues, we tend to look at it as a silo. Okay, but the importance of bringing these issues together is very key. And one of the things we've been doing is looking at the evidence. Okay, how is agriculture linked to forestry? How is it linked to energy? How is it linked to mining? You talked about mining. I lived in Zambia, and the northwestern province, if we don't take care, it's going to wipe away the forest. And how do you look at the primary impact and the secondary impacts, for example, of mining? And therefore, that interconnection is something that we try to do. Within the context of UN RED program, for example, the analysis we do in terms of supporting the National RED Plus strategies is also looking at the interlinkages from even a thematic point of view. So that's very, very key. The second level of integration we're looking at is how we do programming. It's very key. We are just finishing a program in Ghana now, which looks at the northern savanna of Ghana, looking at the share landscape. Although we are looking at share from a climate mitigation point of view, it's linked to employment. 600,000 women depend on it. We've brought in the private sector. You know, how do you process share from the product stage all the way to markets? You know, so the integrated approach to programming, how we design programs, it's very key that the restoration agenda is not seen as a standalone. All right. So this is something that is very important as well. The second area, in terms of the support we are providing to countries, is on the issue of financing and investments. You can have great ideas, but you talked about costing at some point, so how do you finance that in a very creative way? And I should mention there are about 3 ways we are beginning to look at financing. One, of course, is the traditional vertical funds where we have the GEF, we have the Green Climate Funds. In Rwanda, for example, our GEF 6 project focuses on the forest landscape restoration. So those vertical funds are there, and we're supporting countries in many ways to tap into them to address and to promote some of the restoration agenda they have. But we're also beginning to look at innovative ways of financing. I mean, I've been supporting our work in Nigeria, and we're beginning, together with UNEP and others, green bonds, okay? How do we link green bonds to the agenda of restoration, for example? When a country wants to issue its own green bonds, how do we make sure that those issues are really integrated there? And that's very, very key. We're looking, for example, at risk-based instruments. How do you make sure that, because a lot of the financing is going to the agriculture sector, but then if you're expanding cocoa, for example, and you're clearing more forests as a result of cocoa, how do you look at it in terms of addressing the financing aspect of it? So these are things that we are beginning to look at from a financing point of view. Most recently, it's the first time that it happens, under the Green Climate Fund, we supported Brazil to mobilize $96 million for results-based payment. In other words, if a country demonstrates that it has been able to reduce deforestation, you know, you get compensated for that. And that's something that we're beginning to look into for Africa, because most of the time we come late in the game. You know, by the time we are waking up, everybody else is gone. And that's something that we need to pay attention to, together with partners like UNEP, FAO, and others, beginning to look into that area. The third area is on innovation and knowledge management, okay? South-to-South cooperation plays a very key role in our region, and it's very important. And for example, we've supported Kenya to go to Ghana, Ghana to go to Ecuador, Cote d'Ivoire to go to Mexico, I mean, Ethiopia to South Korea, you mentioned that. But these are ways that countries can learn and see what others are doing and be challenged to even do more. And sometimes when you connect to your peers at that level, let's say even at the ministerial level, the presidential level, it makes a lot of difference. And under the theme of knowledge and innovation, one of the things we're also looking at is on accelerator labs. For the first time under our current, the head of UNDP, Akim Steiner, who was in UNEP a couple of years ago now. We've introduced this accelerator lab as a way of how we fast-track some of the development challenges, find innovative solutions to them. And the accelerator labs are not just physical spaces per se, but really about finding solutions to long-term development challenges. We have 60 countries in the world, and a few of them also are here in Africa, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, and many others. And we are beginning to see how we can use some of this accelerator lab to push agendas around restoration. All right? So this is very, very important. Now, let me mention one fourth point, which I think is fundamental to the work that UNDP does on the issue of partnerships. And I think I've mentioned that already. Together with FAO and UNEP, we support many countries in Africa. I can't go into all the details under the UN RED program. But we also have the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, the FCPF. And the FCPF, the only country in Africa that UNDP is supporting is it's Kenya. And I think we've been having discussions also here internally with UNEP how we can support Kenya advance this cause, because it's a very important one, particularly when it comes to issues also around indigenous people and how they can be brought into the discussions around forest restoration. We also have the Central Africa Forest Initiative, CAFI. CAFI is a partnership with 6 African countries, particularly based in the Central African countries. So we have Cameroon, Central African Republic, Gabon, and a few, or DRC Congo, Republic of Congo, looking at how, because they hold the second highest tropical forest after the Amazon, as you may know, and it's important for us to work together in a very strategic way. So these countries, together with some of the partners, bilateral partners and development partners, we've been supporting restoration agenda in many of these countries, and CAFI is capitalized to about $500 million, and we are beginning to roll out implementation through the development of investment plans for this country, again, coming back to the point of restoration that I had raised earlier on. But increasingly, one of the things we've been doing is how do we work at a subnational level with governors who are motivated enough and who want to push the climate agenda. And so through the Governors Climate and Forest Task Force Initiative, we're supporting a number of countries. And in Africa, we're focusing on the Cross River states in Nigeria and also in Cote d'Ivoire. So I can go on, but pretty much in terms of partnerships, these are the areas that we are looking at and supporting that restoration agenda. But finally, on the point of what UNDP is doing, gender issues are key, cross-cutting issues, including stakeholder engagement, women's empowerment, indigenous people issues. These are all part of what we've been trying to do, and they are all integral part of our support to country. Perhaps let me just conclude with some of the key messages, Musonda, from my work here in Africa, and what are some of the things we can share. One key message and one key thing is that government leadership is very key in this whole thing. If the government does not imbibe the agenda in a strategic way, then we've missed the point. You know, ours is just to support and to facilitate, but they need to be in the driver's seat, and I think that is very, very, very key. The second one is to see the restoration agenda as not as a standalone, but to mainstream it into key national planning, policy, financing, and development frameworks. In other words, in many countries in Africa, for example, we have national development plans which set the tone for the 5 years or 10 years that the country wants to engage. So we need to make sure that it's not only there in letter, but the indicators reflect it, and we can push that agenda in a very strategic way. The third one, certainly, it has to do, and I've talked about partnerships already. It's something that we continue have to push. I think sometimes we are fragmented at the country level, so you have different agencies, different NGOs, different civil societies, different people going, and I think we need to create that platform, you know, at the country level, at the regional level, to be able to support our countries in a very strategic way. And I think once we do these things, I think the agenda is going to be a bit more stronger, and we're able to achieve some of the things that we've set ourselves to do. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, and then hopefully if there are questions, I'll be able to answer them. Well, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elsie. I just want to turn to Joyce, because I know she was sort of looking and listening in very intently, and also what has stimulated you in sort of into thinking, how can we do this differently? How can we do this differently and better?
Thank you, Musonda, and thank you, Tony and Elsie, for very stimulating presentations. I was actually reflecting when Tony and Elsie were speaking, and Elsie's summary touched upon some of the points I wanted to mention. I think when we meet in these types of fora, and I like the conversations, Musonda, that you have here together with our partners, we also have to think about how are we going to communicate this to the governments? Why should the governments care? Why should the citizens and people care? If you look at the examples that I cited, Costa Rica and South Korea, the ingredients, the drivers behind the success were actually some of the points that were mentioned by the panelists: the vision, the policy framework, the integration into country-specific development plans, and that led into action because action was actually financed. So I guess the question for us is, are we speaking the language? Are we presenting the value proposition that ministers of planning and finance have to listen to? And especially at the country level where you have competing demands and limited resources, how do we make restoration a positive value proposition for why should ministers care about? I think that's one. Two, if you look ahead, I was again thinking, we have the sciences, we have all the reports that tells us what we need to do, we have the experiences, we have the experts like the ones sitting next to me, but we also have, just between this year and next year, unique opportunities. How do we position ourselves in this topic, whether it's through the decade of restoration, but for example, at the highest political level around the General Assembly, where for the first time, I think the Secretary General is actually calling for action around climate change. So how do we again bring the restoration agenda and the success stories at the highest level for even higher political will? And then next year we have the COP on biodiversity, another fantastic opportunity. But I think if you look on the news and listening to citizens, including youth, people are tired of pledging and politicking. They want action. So how do we deliver to the Gretas of this world or the Kenyan youth that are involved? How do we build on that, goodwill capital from the youth, especially, to drive this agenda forward? So those are just some of the things that crossed my mind listening to my colleagues' presentations. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, you touched on something that is so critical, human capital. I think this is one of the least utilized and sort of underinvested, and we cannot excel around the restoration agenda without investing in human capital, especially young people. I really would like, before I summarize this, I really would like to open this to the public because we're just almost moving into the next segment of our session and our live streaming. If there are any questions, any clarifications, if you can introduce yourself, please. Give us your name, where you're from, and who the question is targeted to. And we have a mic over here, which I'd like to request my colleagues to share to the public. Any questions? Any burning requests? Do not be shy. At the back.
Thanks very much. My name is Diana Kopansky, and I work with UN Environment Program. I wanted to ask any one of the distinguished speakers, I feel like the restoration moment is here, but how do we actually also change the mindset of decision makers or investors, or about how do we use land better? How do we get more for less out of land? Because, Elsie, you mentioned that when we get development, we go to the next piece of tract of land. How can we stop that and use land better, increase productivity, invest in it? I think that how can we share the restoration as an action to do that? I think that that's quite an important piece of communication. So if you have already some responses to that, that'd be great.
Can we take some more questions, please? If you can introduce yourselves.
Thank you very much. My name is Frank Msafiri. I'm from Sustainable Environment Development Watch in Kenya. I just want to maybe thank all the speakers there and come to UNDP because I remember one time UNDP used to support some community initiatives in Kenya. And I remember I was championing that. And this is the only way I feel that we can be able to get closer to restoration. Because nobody will come from outside the community to do restoration within the community area. Programs comes, and when the program comes, they are left like that's UNDP, that's GF programs and so on. We want the community to own the programs. Also, the issue of mainstreaming of some of these programs. We are moving in the right direction in Kenya because the National Climate Change Action Plan requires that every sector of the government develop or establish a desk, climate desk. And to ensure that all issues pertaining to climate change are addressed within the ministry. So how do we strengthen this? How do we bring this one as a policy direction so that the government can also bring an issue of restoration to all the sectors? Because if you look at all the sectors, they somehow impact on restoration. I think this is very critical. The government is a leader in the programs, but how do you, as a civil society, ensure that the government engage you without even calling for engagement? I think those are very critical issues. I also like the issue of forming partnership. We have come together as civil societies in Kenya to form what we are calling committee restoration group, where we are bringing all the partners together from central Kenya, from Rift Valley, from everywhere, to be able to address the partnership, the restoration. So we want support for that. It's a very new program, but our idea is to see how we can be able to ensure everybody who is working within a certain region comes on board so that we can be able to exchange ideas and experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. One more question at the back, please. Just one more. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Calvin Nyarwanda. Yes, just to introduce a little bit, well, I have two questions, or two suggestions, so to say. We have said that we want to invest money into programs. And for the past 8 months, I've been volunteering and for Yale Youth Entrepreneurship. We were here previously, the 2018 youth category, and we have realized that young people have projects that they're doing. But these projects doesn't attract easy funding. And so it becomes a source of frustration for young people. Is there a way that the UNEP or other organizations can say that if they're donating 10 shillings or $10, then $1 must go for a youth program, or $2, something of that kind, so that we have a direct action, knowing that if we are funding a program in Kenya, then for every $10 they donate, then $2 must go to an action that is directly either supporting women or supporting young people. The second part that I wanted to ask was about, I have been running a program in Migori County, and we realized that sometimes there's difficulty in us trying to bring people to understand what we are trying to do. We are trying to ensure that they do mixed cropping as a means of addressing biodiversity. But we find that this is quite a huge challenge for young people to pick up. So we want support in terms of how do we ensure that communities understand that if you do single cropping, then it becomes a challenge to the nature of soil you're trying to do. We find a lot of political challenge because it's a problem to us. So we believe that we'll be helped in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid, in the interest of time, I would like to request maybe Elsie to start, and then the rest of the panel members can react, because we have to close this session.
Thank you very much for all the questions. I think let me respond to Diana's question and perhaps tie it also to your question, Joyce. How do we make the case? How do we convince the ministers of finance? How do we make sure that land is used appropriately? And I think there are 3 or 4 points I wanted to raise. One is that we need to have the data. You know, I mean, sometimes we think we have the data, but it's not compelling enough. And I think we need to do a bit of some robust analysis to really show the evidence and the trade-offs as well. And the second point is that, and this is in relation to your point, Joyce, the Minister of Finance doesn't want to just hear about forest. The Minister of Finance wants to hear about employment, about trade, about energy, about everything. And we need to be able to link the forest and restoration agenda needs to be seen as a locomotive that links other sectors together. That's when they begin to listen. Because if you don't do that, well, then too bad. I mean, they see it just as a standalone. The third one is on innovative approaches. How do we use land in a sustainable way? Let's take the case of cocoa. Practical example. Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana produce maybe 65% of the world's cocoa, all right? And we can see that already forests are being encroached into because, of course, the private sector and even the government wants to expand the cocoa and get more money and resources. How do you make the case that they can still do what they want in a different way? Okay, and so, for example, if you take Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, they're introducing cocoa agroforestry, for example, where they're saying that, look, don't expand, grow more trees, and the cocoa does better, and the shade. Okay, and so the private sector is getting more excited. So the case is not about corporate social responsibility. The case is about business sustainability for the private sector as well. And I think that's the case when you talked about the case. These are some of the things we need to be able to show. Along the value chain, what can we do differently? So we need to unpack that as well. And we have to simplify the language. I mean, you know, we're in the UN and sometimes we are very verbose. So when you go somewhere, people don't just listen to you because you're using very big language, mainstreaming, integration. Let's say these women, if you don't grow more share trees, I mean, Ghana is losing rapidly all these share trees, and 600,000 women depend on it. These are the things the government wants to hear, to their own political agenda, and that's the reality, okay? Now, coming back to the point you raised, Frank, I mean, thank you very much. I mean, UNDP continues to play a very strong role in terms of our work with civil society, communities, indigenous people. In the space of RED in Kenya, for example, we have just our program on the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, which is a 3.8 million program, has a very strong focus on communities. We took almost 2 years to discuss what the modalities will be, what the engagement would be, and we continue to do that. So you can rest assured that these are some of the instruments available to you. Even within the context of UN RED program, we have the community-based RED Plus. It hasn't started in Kenya yet, but it's on the agenda. And I think it could be one space where we can also continue to engage with you. The SGP program, the Jeff SGP also is another instrument. Now, the question of we can discuss some more bilaterally on this, Mark, so I don't take too much time. The question on the youth, it's a very important point. I think both governments and partners like us need to be looking at the youth agenda very differently in a very strategic way, including the question of finance. How do we make sure that we have, you know, venture financing, angel finance, I don't know how you call it, but something that doesn't have too much interest rate, because otherwise, you know, it's very difficult for the youth to really break through in that particular sense. But also we need to find ways of helping in terms of coaching. How do you pair youth with other, you know, actors who are in that space in a way that they can be able to draw lessons and skills to inform their own work that they're doing. So I think the youth agenda is very interesting. I mean, in the case of us, UNDP, for example, in Uganda, we've started a graduate volunteer program, very interesting, where, you know, we're supporting them for a year, but then we are we are placing them in spaces where they can also learn from, and then hopefully we can get some financing for them to also start implementation of the ideas that they have. What else was there? I think that's about it, yeah. Tony?
Good, thanks very much. Yeah, 3 very interesting questions, thanks very much. And with Joyce's comments before, probably it comes down to incentives. There's no quick fixes with ecological restoration or ecosystem restoration. It's going to take time. One of the best examples of that anywhere in the world is in northern Tigray. And you can go to this one village, and the government were clearing people off the land, rightfully so, because there was drought, there was no vegetation, livestock were dying, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of emergency relief. In this one community, there's only 900 households in this community, and they said, look, we're going to lose our land, we're going to lose it unless we do something about it. So they made it mandatory that if you wanted to be a member of our village, you had to work for 40 days in the watershed, planting trees, watering trees, keeping out livestock, building check dams, installing Gambians. And it worked. It took 20 years, but it's worked. The water table went from 12 meters down to 1 meter down. 1,350 youth came back from the towns and cities to the village. Because there's enterprise, there's money, there's economy, there's things moving. So if we turned up to that village 25 years ago and said, do you know what, we've got a brand new UN program on ecosystem restoration, you know, there wouldn't have been a word to translate it into. I'm sure there's not a word in Kiswahili or Amharic or other areas where you see that. In other parts, in Akan, in Sinhalese. So we've got to speak to the farmers in their language. Do you want better water holding capacity? Do you want reduced erosion? Do you want diversity in case you don't have all of your money into one crop? Elsie mentioned cocoa. Now, the problem with cocoa is it's so labor intensive that if a man and woman have 5 hectares of cocoa, it would take them 2 months to process them on their own. They can't hire any labor because the price is too low, so they use children. And that child labor takes kids out of school. It also attracts slaves from Burkina Faso and Liberia, and it's a huge problem. But we've got to have a remunerative return. Côte d'Ivoire's lost 94% of its forest to cocoa, 94%. They have made $130 billion of revenue. They've lost a $150 billion asset. They've lost money providing the world with cocoa. So we've got to flip the economics on that and make it sensible to that landholder. And what's that long-term incentive inducement going to be to reinforce things that we know that the Minister of Finance and other people want to be doing anyway. So I think that as we use this decade on ecosystem restoration, let's use it wisely, because it will just have been come and gone. I went to 21 COPs, and I was starting to get a bit jaded until Paris, because, you know, in these big meetings, there were only generally 2 things that were agreed. And that was the date and venue of the next meeting. Because everything was either left in square brackets or moved on. And that's not good enough when it comes to the health and the vitality of our planet. We went into Sri Lanka with some concepts around restoration of the land health. And the thing that really got the Minister of Finance there and the President was land health is national wealth. And they could connect it to national and household and business opportunities. And that's, if we're very clever about it, that's how we will also go back. And not just private sector, but private investors. Because, you know, we're mainly supported by overseas development assistance as our UNEP and UNDP. For every $1 of ODA, there's $3 of remittances. There's $6 of foreign direct investment. There's $24 of domestic private sector spend in developing countries. There's $35 of government expenditure, and there's $1,000 of private capital to be mobilized. So if we keep fishing in that small dollar pond and forget about connecting to these other sources of investment, and to do that, they're going to want to see de-risking. So they'll go for low returns if it can be de-risked, and if we can pool and work together in those resources.
Thank you very much, Tony. Joyce, last thoughts.
Yeah, so I just wanted to respond to the question from the youth. I actually, first I have to congratulate you for what you're doing in your capacity. I would also say you have quite a lot of power at 2 or 3 levels that I can think of. If you look at some of the countries that have done well vis-a-vis youth engagement, one is using your political voice, whether it's the power of voting or influencing, the big policy agenda in your own, starting from the community level. You are the future, so most politicians tend to listen to the youth. I think second, I would agree with what Elsie mentioned. We need to look for more innovative way of supporting in terms of financing. The reason being, as I'm sure you know, we get funding mostly from the donors, and they tend to have very specific themes that they want their projects to be implemented in. So linked to that, what I have seen, I come from Tanzania, some of the examples from Tanzania, there are twinning arrangements where, say, a youth group, I don't know much about Kenya, say in Tanzania, that has twinned with another youth group, say in Europe. And that youth group puts pressure on their parliaments to actually allocate financing for youth activities. And lastly, I would say foundations. There are a number of foundations that, for example, the Gates Foundation that has youth programs. So that could be another avenue to pursue. They don't tend to have a lot of strings attached vis-a-vis, say, links to government programs as some of the multilateral organizations do. But I think your voice clearly matters from influencing politics from behind and resource allocation.
Thank you very much.
The youth, there's a UN youth strategy, which has been launched also by the Secretary General. It outlines some of the key things that you've mentioned, and I think the UN is working around that to support the youth. I just thought I would mention that.
Thank you very much. Joyce, do we have a word of restoration in Kiswahili in Tanzania? Because we always have new words.
You're putting me on the spot, I'm looking for any Tanzanian. Actually, I don't think we do. But you're smiling, my brother. Do you know the Kiswahili word for restoration? Kenyans speak better Kiswahili than Tanzanians. But no, frankly, no, Nemo, serious. I will find it, but I don't know for now.
Great. On that note, a round of applause for the panelists. Well, thank you so very much, and I know that you're very busy and will be transitioning to the next part of this live streaming, so thank you very much. You're more than welcome to leave before we just upstream a video, which we're about to watch, and you're also welcome to stay to watch it. Thank you very much.
Or you could just walk in one and see for yourself. See that forests are more than trees. See they are home to countless living beings. Living beings like you and me, whose lives are better with forests. Forests that bring us rain, rivers, water. Water that brings us food in the forest and beyond. Forests bring peace, quiet. The very air we breathe. They keep us cool. And not just people. The whole planet. People need forests. And now, more than ever, forests need people. Healthy forests absorb and store greenhouse gas like huge sponges. But the destruction of forests releases those greenhouse gases. Emissions from destroyed forests are higher than those from cars, trucks, ships, and planes combined. Forests are the fastest, cheapest climate solution. Better with forests.
Thank you. For those of us joining us here in Nairobi, this is GLF Kyoto and streaming live from Nairobi. We're just getting into the second session of a very exciting afternoon here in Nairobi, really looking at the whole issue of ecosystem restoration. And now we're going to deep dive and have some very, very, very exciting examples from Kenya or from this region even. And also we're so really happy to have practitioners who are coming from the community and doing really exciting work in terms of restoration. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel members. On my very extreme left, we've got Claire Nasike, who is the founder of the Hummingbird, an organization that really is looking at communities and working on issues related to restoration and also working with youth, herself being a youth. And right next to her is Joan Tunui, who is the founder of Green Towns Initiatives. And I will talk a little bit about that because we're smack in the middle of a city that actually has the world-famous Karura Forest. So all of these elements of greening towns and cities. And right next to her is Mark Nicholson, who is the founder of Plants for Life, and also really working with communities across Kenya and looking at how we can work with tree planting and other initiatives in relation to restoration. Lastly but not the least, I've got Herbert, who is right here next with me, working as part of the Landscape Restoration Coalition based here in Kenya, and really bringing together a constituency of different stakeholders who are doing really exciting work across the country. Welcome. I would like to start with you, Mark, because I know that you have a presentation to do. If we can have it ready, please. Very exciting. You've been the founder of Plants for Life across Kenya. We'll just have your presentation ready. Mark is going to take us through the story of restoration and how this has worked over the years and what they've been doing. And from this, really why conservation is so important and really relevant within a country context. Over to you.
Thank you, Masanda. Good afternoon, everybody. We started a project 20 years ago on forest restoration in an area where I live, which is about 25 kilometers north of here. And I'll explain why. How do we move on? How do I move on to the next slide? Can I do it from here? Or?
We'll do it for you.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So, as I say, a 30-year project. Why 30 years? Because in my opinion, you cannot restore a forest under 30 years. So I hope I'm still alive in 10 years' time, but it's a very small project. It's only 40 hectares. But we do call it a model restoration, and we have people from all over the world coming to have a look at what we've done. It is a private restoration project, and the most important thing is that it's very easy because it's private land. It's very easy to protect. As an example, last year we planted 300 trees on a nearby school, and I went to have a look the other day, and of those 300 trees, 5 trees are left. You cannot restore unless you can protect, and that's why community restoration is very difficult. So I'm not interested in people saying I planted 1 million trees because what percentage is alive. I want to see how many trees are alive in 10 years, 15 or 20 years' time. I have a problem with the Kenya forest definition of a forest, which is 15% forest cover. You can start off with a forest with 100% and you can halve it and you're still forest cover, and you can make it a quarter, 25%, you're still forest cover. The statistics, as I said there at the bottom, forest destruction hides behind statistics. I go all over Kenya, from Loima right in the north on the Sudan border to right down in the south, to Kasigao and to places like that, and I find that forest is disappearing, and yet the Kenya Forest Service tells me the forest is increasing. It is not increasing in my opinion. I probably traveled 250,000 kilometers in the last 20 years, and practically everywhere I see forest disappearing. Next slide, please. And when we talk about restoration, I was going to ask this earlier, what exactly is restoration? It hasn't been well defined in my mind. If we're talking about restoration, are we talking about rewilding, taking it back to where it was 100 years? The answer is no, we can't, unless it's somewhere in a protected area like a national park. For most of the time, we're talking about presumably agricultural systems or semi-agricultural systems, And how long does it take to restore something? Well, look there, look at my figures. Now that's what I think. I'm actually, I'm a vet, I'm a soil scientist as well as an ecologist. And if you've lost your soil, if you look there, you probably lost 2 meters of soil. How long is it going to take you to restore that? 100 years, 1,000 years? Your guess is as good as mine. Our forest, I'm giving it 30 years. Next, thank you. This I took on the way to the Mara a few years ago. That is solid rock. How long is it going to take to restore that? It's going to take an awful long time, and people don't think about that. The Bond Challenge says we've got to restore 5.1 million hectares in Kenya within the next 10 years. Well, good luck to Kenya. I think it's not going to be possible, but we'll talk about that later. Next. This is the area where I work, and I took that because there 95% of all the trees there are exotic: eucalyptus, hakea, wattle. It's mainly tea areas. So if you're talking about restoring there, what are we trying to restore to? Well, you can't restore a tea plantation. It's a tea plantation. You're never going to be able to restore it with the land pressure in Kenya to anything like a forest. But what we've tried to do, next slide please, what we've tried to do is to restore. And of course in exotic plantations you have very low biodiversity. That's a nearby plantation to us, very low biodiversity underneath those trees. Next. Our major problem, our major challenge is probably invasive species. If you tried to restore a forest and just put a fence around the area and left it, you would have 95% invasive species within no time at all. You cannot do it unless you do what we call active restoration, not passive restoration. Next. So this is what it looks like. This is a photograph I took from an old film camera in the year 2000. If you just note that tree at the top, that's a puteria or waramuna in Gikuyu. Look at all the other trees: black wattle, eucalyptus, cypress, 99% exotic species. Next, please. Now look at the tree again. That's the same tree 17 years later, and that's what we've done. We have recreated an indigenous forest. Next, sorry, just go back 1 second, please. Back. Thank you. We put in 600 species of indigenous trees and shrubs. And there are only about 1,200 indigenous species of trees and shrubs in Kenya, so we put in roughly half Kenya's amount. We've implanted 120,000 trees, and we have a survivability of about 95, 97%. Next, please. So we took down all the But meanwhile, we hack away, and we probably spend half our budget on getting rid of invasive species. Next slide, please. And then eventually, once we've got rid of all the invasive species, then we do understory planting. Understory planting is very important. It's not just a question of having a forest, it's everything else that's all the understory species. Next slide, please. This is an example of how quickly, someone mentioned to me the other day, we can't plant an indigenous forest because it's going to take 200 years. I said, rubbish, and I took this photograph. This is 2009. Now just look at that bare patch. Next slide. That's exactly the same spot 10 years later. So you can grow indigenous forest remarkably quickly. Next, please. So that's a general overview. There's much more here, but this is a general overview of the front of our forest. There's a few exotics right at the top, but the whole of the rest of it is indigenous species. Next slide, please. We obviously have a tree nursery, so we collect trees from seeds from all over the place. And we do try and get as wide as a number of species as possible. Next, please. We did have a cypress plantation. Now, that was much easier than the eucalyptus, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Eucalyptus, cypress, once you cut it down, it will not regrow, so it's very easy to replant a cypress plantation. We planted grass. In 2000, we planted grass, and 3 years later, it looked like this. This is, I think, 2003. No invasive weeds you'll see there. There's no regrowth from the cypress. Next slide, please. And that's what it looks like 17 years later. That's me in the same spot. Next one, please. We also have a wetland, and we have a river, And what's interesting is that we are now getting water from our forests going into the river, and this is clean water. Upstream there is a dam which is filthy because people do all their washing there. But 2 kilometers downstream, the wetland is totally clean, that water, and I would drink this water, but I would not drink it anywhere further upstream. Next. People don't realize how important soil organic matter is to the soil. I went to a Calro or Takari conference about 20 years ago, and someone stood up and said, the only thing which is positively correlated always, apart from water, always correlated with crop growth is soil organic matter. Nothing else matters, not nitrate, not phosphate, not potassium, soil organic matter. Now here on the left, there's almost nothing there. I measured it the other day, maybe 1% if you were lucky, 1% organic matter. Up there on the right, we're looking at 23%. This is in our forest, 23% organic matter in the first 10 centimeters of soil. Soil organic matter is absolutely vital for farmers. If you cut down your forest, your organic matter is oxidized, and the organic matter of the soil goes right down, and your crop yields go down as well. Next, please. Ecosystem services. Well, I think it's fairly obvious. I mean, soil fertility, carbon sequestration. It's lovely and cool. The soil is protected, of course. We now have perennial water. We have one of the few river valleys where we have perennial water all year round. If you look at all the eucalyptus valleys around us, you only get water for 2 or 3 months per year. And we have increased biodiversity, which I'll show you. Next, please. There we are planting on government land. On the other side of the river, on the other side of our forest, we have government land. All that green stuff there, anybody know what that is? That is wattle seedlings coming up in their thousands. Very, very, and all that has to be weeded. Next, please. No, one more. We're also measuring the trees. We're measuring the growth rate of the trees. We're measuring the diameter, the phenology, when they flower, when they fruit. This is a plot where we put in 50 species, 50 fastest growing ones. We're looking at what we call the restoration species rather than the species which come on later. Next, please. Our only problem really, apart from invasive species, are antelope. This is, and antelope will target certain species. They've actually targeted probably 10 species completely and killed them all. So we do have a small problem. But up on Mount Kenya, you've got a problem with elephant. And up in a place like Kakamega, you've got a problem with cattle and also abidares. So livestock is probably your main enemy of forest restoration. Next, please. We've got lots of rare species. On the top left is quite interesting. That's a rare species of sausage tree, Kigelia musa from Kakamega, which is bat pollinated. If you don't have bats, you're not going to have any sausages. The one on the bottom right is an extremely rare plant, it's an endemic to Tigoni, and one plant on Mount Kenya, which was found in 1922, which I rediscovered about 2 years ago. We've got that on the IUCN red list at critically endangered. There are only 5 adult plants in the world. We've now got 200 of them. Next, please. Ferns, next. So I always say a forest is more than trees. You're looking at trophic levels. You're looking at what eats the leaves and what eats the animal that's eating the leaves and what doo-doos are doing what and all this sort of stuff. So we have a lot of different species, including the three-horned chameleon. We also have the other chameleon. Next one, please. We have colobus monkeys came in naturally in 2015. They'd been away for 80 years. I know that from my neighbors who have been there. In fact, their grandmother started Brackenhurst in 1911. And they said for 80 years there had been no colobus monkeys. Next, please. Bush babies, you can see a list of some of the other species. Next, please. Bats, as I said, very important. We see a lot of bats at night. Next. Hornbills, which I also call charismatic species. We've now got 188 species of birds which we've measured on our forest. Next. Sunbirds, next. Hedgehogs, which are quite rare in Kenya now. And then, of course, all our understory species. It can be orchids or impatiens. Next, please. What do we know about fungi? What do we know about lichens? We had a group from Finland last year looking at, and they identified in one tree 25 species of fungi. Lichens. What do we know about lichens? We know nothing about lichens at all. But a lot of them are very medicinal and they're very important. Next, please. Then at night time we have civet cats, we have giant forest, we have bush pigs, we have jenny cats. We even had a leopard the other day, which is quite exciting. Next, please. Education is probably our most important thing. We bring up people from all over Kenya, and internationally we've had people from Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and we show them what we're trying to do. Next. This was quite interesting because we have a coffee plantation now. We have Ethiopian coffee, and it's deep shade coffee, which is the best. I'm sure most of you know that coffee comes from Ethiopia. It's a deep shade Rubiaceae, and we've now planted it in the forest, and it's yielding very well already. Next. There are two plants there people are collecting. The one at the bottom is Nderema. Is it called Nderema? You know, Nderema, Basella alba, which is an indigenous vegetable from the forest. People come in, Luyas and Gusis come in and collect Nderema, also called soap spinach. I don't know how many of you know. And this false banana is called enchet or enset. It's an Ethiopian, it's very common in Ethiopia as a staple food, and it grows very well in our forest. It's native here, and I don't think Kenyans use it. Am I right? Anybody know that? Anybody here from Kenya? Anybody? But if you go to an Ethiopian restaurant, you can eat this. Next, please. So there they are, selling it. We let them have that for free. And then on the right-hand side, you can see offcuts. And later on, I'm not at all against cutting down big trees, provided you regrow them. We've got a small Meru oak plantation of about probably 1,000 Meru oaks. Within 20 years, that will be harvestable, and you'll get a lot of money for it. Next, please. So lessons learned. I'll just go quickly through them. There are 10. People talk about restored forest. I said, well, what do you mean by restored? I do not think we have a restored forest. We are restoring it, and we are under restoration, but it's going to take 30 or more years that I can actually stand up and say, I think we have restored a forest. As I've said, passive restoration doesn't work. You've got to clearly define and quantify what you're talking about restoration. I don't mind whether you talk about the area, or the tons of carbon you've sequestered, the value of income generating activities, the soil parameters, whatever it is. You've got to record it, you've got to quantify it, you've got to give a value to it, otherwise people will not be interested. Number 4, restoration. Sure, it's expensive, it's long-term and difficult. And I'm sorry our VIPs are not here with us, because I was going to say we work, and I think we're all at the same table here in the same situation. We work on peanuts. All my staff get minimum wages. I've been working for 20 years without a wage. I work as a volunteer. It's expensive, it's difficult. We've spent $1 million, probably $1 million, which we've raised, and it's difficult to get money. And yet UNEP and these other organizations say, oh, next decade is going to be the decade of restoration. How do we get the money, the small people doing it? Next slide, please. You cannot restore a forest unless you know your trees. You've got to know your trees. And we have so many people coming up, young people particularly, come up and we say, right, name 5 trees in your local languages. And they stand there in silence. Their grandparents would have known it. But loss of indigenous knowledge is as important as loss of indigenous forest. We're talking about 5.1 million hectares in the Bond Challenge. Well, I'm amazed because we've spent $1 million on doing 40 hectares, which is apparently very cheap. We've spent just over $1 million. That's very little money. You extrapolate that up to 5.1 million hectares and you look at what you're talking about. Are the seeds available? That's another important thing. We talk about this massive reforestation, but where do we get seeds? We struggle ourselves in our little project. Where are seeds? Where can I find 1 million seedlings? And we don't want 1 million seedlings, we want 500 million seedlings. And we want them by 2020 so we can show something in 2030. They're not available. And the final thing is community-based restoration is going to be much, much more difficult. I've worked on community restoration 10 years in both in West Pokot and also in Baringo. There's not much to see for 10 years of work we did up there, and it's very sad. We can show something because we can protect it because we're private. Community work is very, very challenging, and I think most of you would agree. So number 11, I would say, and it's not there, is we need money somehow, and we will talk about that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I know that we have to, that live stream is going to go off at 4 p.m., I'm afraid, but I really want to go very quickly to the speakers on the panel. That was a really stimulating presentation that you just made, Mark, and really putting a spotlight on the cost and also a spotlight on the importance of indigenous knowledge and the spotlight also on the power of community, and just we just cannot just put a tree there and help, just anticipate that it will survive. Claire, I want to come to you. In terms of your work from Hummingbird, can you share with us some experiences in terms of what you've done, how you've worked around and also working with young people? What's worked, what hasn't worked, and how do you see this restoration agenda as something that's important within your work?
Thank you, Musonda.
In a few minutes.
Our work with the Hummingbird Foundation involves restoring the earth. Quite huge, but our entry point is we're looking at cities and particularly the slum areas. And we are setting up edible ecosystems. By edible ecosystems, we are setting up gardens. These are food gardens within schools that have no trees whatsoever. So far, we've set up 3 food gardens within Mathare slums, and we are also in satellites. We have set up the 3 food gardens that pupils in these schools depend on entirely for food. We've got about 17 young girls who depend on 1 food garden for their vegetables. These are indigenous vegetables, and we're not just setting up gardens for vegetables only. We're also setting up botanical gardens where they get there and learn about trees, what trees are medicinally important, what trees are increasing soil fertility, what trees can be used as plant extracts to control pests and fungi on the vegetables that they are growing in their schools. So what we have achieved so far, and this is from their teachers, there has been an improved interest in environmental matters. We're talking about children in the slums, children that have no trees in their schools, children that are experiencing pollution firsthand. We're talking about environmental degradation. So we have been able to note an improved interest in matters environment from their teachers since we started in 2017. And apart from that, we also have about 80 kids in 1 school that depend on 1 vegetable garden. And 80 is a huge number for kids who do not have food or who do not have breakfast at home. And when they come to school, they're looking at this garden as their source of lunch or their source of dinner, because they're allowed to pluck vegetables and carry some of them home. And it has been challenging for us. When we say working in the slums, you would imagine this is a school, it has walls, you have concrete walls, you've got a gate, and it's easier for you to establish vegetable gardens or food gardens. But that has not been the case. Most schools in these slum areas, one of the things they lack is space. So we have to be extremely creative and come up with portable gardens that can benefit the kids. Apart from that, we also have to be able to work with the communities around. I remember in 1 school, we set up the food gardens, and they were in portable tins, and the community members, over the school holidays, the community members jumped through the iron fence and carried away the vegetables. So when the kids got back, they were like, "Oh, Teacher Claire, we don't have our vegetables. Where did they go?" And the security guard just told us, the community members go here, the spinach was ready, the kunde was ready, the cowpeas were ready, and they just took them away. And that is one of the major challenges we are currently facing. And so at Hummingbird, we are hoping that we can upscale this by involving communities, set up community gardens, create awareness to the community members within the slums on the importance of these gardens, not only as a source of food to these pupils who go to school on an empty stomach, but also as a measure to restore some of the degraded spaces within those schools. Because when you look at the schools in the slums, they're not as the schools in Gigiri, the schools in other parts of Nairobi. Their ecosystem is quite different. There's a lot of pollution going on in the slums, and that is where our work is based. That is what we're looking at, restoring and creating a change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Coming to you, Joan, you're working in the Green Towns Initiative. What actually stimulated you wanting to do that?
Okay, thank you so much, Musonda. My name is Joan Tonui. As she said, she's pronouncing as Joan. So, yeah, and I want to thank the UN Environment for inviting me for this discussion. Green Towns Initiative I started in 2016 when I was able to mobilize a group of youth to come together to think of something that we can do to give back to the community. And since I was born and raised in Bomet and living in a place where it's so green, I used to see rivers passing in our compound, and we could swim. We could just come out of the house and swim outside. But now when I was growing up, I saw these rivers drying up. I could no longer swim. I could go for many distance in order to fetch water, to get water to come in and assist in the household cause. So this really motivated me to starting up an activity that aims at protecting ecosystems, and also mostly particularly to those who are near the town areas, because the ecosystems which are located within the town areas face a lot of challenges as it flows downstream. For instance, this pilot project which I started up is at Nyangores River. This is a river that flows within Bomet County and flows to the Mara Basin, to Serengeti. This is a river that everyone in the world sees, because it holds the 7 wonders of the world. So if this river dries at the upstream, the downstream is destroyed fully. So the many challenges that this river passes through is the poor agricultural activities along the river. There is vast planting of eucalyptus trees along the river, which we all know that eucalyptus trees takes up a lot of water, consuming the water from the river. There are also activities like car washing. There is huge pollution in rivers that passes through the town, through the car washing, and greases get into water. And just a few meters from where the car washing is done, few meters are the kids or people fetching water from that river. It's really saddens if you see the reality of this. So this project, we aim at using the communities, the young people, the women, the young people and the young women living along the river to actually be the key players in this project. We call them the river guardians. We are engaging them in how we're doing this is we are trying to give an alternative way of eucalyptus trees, since it's the biggest challenge. And because they plant the eucalyptus, because it's an economic value to them. They sell to the tea factories, they sell to companies which they use, or even to schools, they take it for school fees. So we are bringing an alternative way to this eucalyptus. This is using of bamboo. Bamboo is a plant that it's really important because it does not only protect the river, it does not only conserve the river, but also it acts as a source of livelihood to many people. Because if you plant bamboo along the river, you own the bamboo trees and you can make products out of it and sell, and you are able to earn a living out of it. So we are creating this alternative by planting bamboo and engaging these river guardians, not only to plant bamboo along the river and to take care of this bamboo, but also to prevent the river and protect the river against these challenges that it's facing as it flows downstream to the Mara River. We also did not want to leave out the young people in this project, because these are the future generation, and we want to nurture them to become the champions of the environment. And we are calling these young champions, the river champions. So we are engaging the primary schools located within the river in a way that they can compete amongst themselves in items like poems, in speeches, in drawings. Like for instance, last week when we were doing this activity in one school, a kid, I think and standard 4, about maybe 10 years, gave me a drawing to mark, which he drew a drawing where there were pollution. It showed the river flowing, and there is open defecation, if you understand open defecation, and then someone is fetching water just after that activity, just a few meters after. And I was really impressed that if a kid can understand the pollution and how this river is really polluted, how about if we now empower them and to give them more information and create more awareness to them, they are able to become the champions of environment. So we are engaging them in this activity where they compete and we choose the river champions. The winners from this competition are the river champions, so that we are able to engage them in any activity that we carry along the river Nyongores or in schools, and they are able to come up with tree nurseries, and they're able also to take up the messages to their parents. So this is majorly what we are doing in Green Towns Initiative. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for that. If you can just switch that off, thank you. Thank you very much. Very quickly, because we have a few questions that are actually coming in online. Herbert, you're part of the Kenya Consortium on Landscape Restoration. Can you tell us a little bit what's this, because earlier on we listened to the first part of the conversation and the issue of partnership emerged as something that's very important. Very quickly, can you just tell us very briefly how this has worked?
So KCLR is a Kenya Consortium on Landscape Restoration. It was born on 5th of April this year, after we had a big meeting between the practitioners and the policymakers. And during the plenary session, it came out that we need to link us up, because various people presented their projects. We'd find people presenting proposals of projects which have been done in the same area as others were done. Now, linking them together will help them share data, and they will start at a better place. Other things are also, we know various people who do the work of conservation in various counties, and we have 6 government members. Definitely KFS is included, KWS, as they were represented in that meeting. And also we have 13 plus, because today we have gotten 2 new members who have joined us. So we basically want to help the government and other national policy documents which have been proposed on various projects, to see where we can come in and where we can help. And that's where my brother, who had asked about where such projects as his will come in. How can we finish what we pledged, the 5.1 billion hectares, only by networking? So we aim at restoring not only forest but landscapes. There are birders in here, there are wildlife people, and most of them are forest restoration practitioners. So our aims are creating awareness. We also aim at training, both technical and other facets which will help execute the work. We also want so much to do information sharing, whereby we are creating a website, and every member and player will be updating their work. And when we do apply for funds from donors and such, they'll be seeing the work from our database. We also want to share policy documents, so that no one goes to it without knowing that there's a framework set, or there's a donors and funders doing the same thing who don't know that you're doing that work. So it's a big thing that has started, and we are already rolling the ball. So we need help from you and from any other person, especially by being members and also showing you a direction where we'll fund. Our location is at Brackenhurst. That's where we held the meeting, and that's where the baby was born. So that's where it will be nurtured. That's where we have the forest. I stand here to represent the Secretariat as the Secretary, and we have other members in the House, and we welcome you all in it.
Well, thank you so very much, Herbert, for that. It's just ironically and coincidentally, that was my daughter's birthday, 5th of April. So I would imagine that's a sign of good luck. Yeah. And this consortium will grow to bigger heights, and we're really looking forward to sort of engaging and getting a sense of how community and the power of sharing and partnerships can actually be a driver in making sure that restoration happens and happens better. There is a question. There are a few questions. I think because we took questions from the floor, we're going to go online. There's a gentleman from, there's a gentleman, his name is Peter Kilonzo, who is asking, perhaps this is a question for Mark, where can I get Polonia elongata seeds from?
I'm very good on the highland trees, but I have no idea whether anybody, which one did you say, Paulinia? We have Paulinia, but I've never heard of that one before.
Yeah, Polonia elongata. Well, Peter, if you're listening, we will try and find an answer for that. If you can send us your email.
If it is Paulinia, we have it.
Yes,
but I don't
but is
recognize
it elongata?
I'm not sure which one it is, but we have Paulínia, but we have it at
Okay.
Brackenhurst, yeah.
So there you are. You can come and visit Brackenhurst. The other question we have is, how can students play a role to prevent mangrove loss? I don't know if anybody has worked on mangroves.
Mangroves. No, we're not mangrove. We're not.
No, we have no mangrove specialists, I'm afraid. Anyone in the crowd who's a mangrove specialist? Okay, we have no mangrove specialist. The last question is coming from John Kimani that is saying, how can youth participate in the UN decade? Youth can participate in the UN decade, and I'll respond to that if I can use my discretion as a UN Environment staff member and someone who will be taking a lead on this decade. They can participate really by reaching out. We're just really trying to formulate and work around what this decade is going to look like. UN Environment is going to lead the element of advocacy. And so we're going to be reaching out to everybody. This is, I think, the first decade within the UN system that will be incredibly immersive. Everybody has to be a part of this because ultimately we are all citizens of this planet. So we'll reach out to you. Look out on our website. We're going to share on the GLF website a Wikipedia page, including contacts, information, and other relevant information that is quite useful for everybody to be aware of what it is that we're doing. At this juncture, I really would like to take maybe one question from the group, from the resident group here in Nairobi. There's a gentleman. Yes, please, James. If you can introduce yourself, please.
It's just a question.
Yes.
I find our leadership is having a target of trees to be planted. And you find some of the finalists or panelists doubting that. What is the problem? I find China converting desert to forest. I have seen tubes, YouTubes. What is problem with us in Africa?
Well, I cannot answer that as we have 5 minutes to go and we need to actually close this. We have tea outside, and I think this is a really good moment to network and have this conversation as frank and as open as possible. I really would like to take this opportunity to begin to close this conversation because we're going to go offline fairly soon. I think you ask a very valid question, and maybe if there's a thought from anyone, one last really quick thought to react to that question, but we're more than welcome to interact and have these open conversations offline as we stand outside. Any reactions? Claire, please.
Just a reaction to his question. I think the reason why we don't achieve what we set out to achieve most of the time is that we don't have essential partnership. You find that scientists and botanists and ecologists are working in silos. So if we all can come together and work together as individuals with one objective, then it is possible for us to achieve that. China did it. Maybe they did it because they were able to work together. So Kenya can also borrow a leaf and work in the same direction. Yeah, that would be my thought.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think I'd like to summarize and say that when we listened to the first part of the conversation, one of the interventions that was made was coming from Ms. Elsie Atafora from UNDP, who said that the South-South learning is so critical. I think what hasn't happened very well is that a lot of times we think that our solutions are really just happening only within our communities, and yet there's someone somewhere doing almost the exact same thing. So how can we draw those lessons and begin to have really sort of experiences instead of us really starting from the very beginning, those low-hanging fruits. And just listening from this panel, it's been absolutely exciting and really interesting, and we hope that people joining us online out there have learned so much from the discussions that happened at the very beginning and also that have happened in the second part. And I think the film that we shared also captured the essence and the importance of landscapes, because ultimately what we're restoring isn't, as you've rightly said, Herbert, it's not just about the trees. It's really about the landscape as is, the rangelands, the different landscapes and forest types or wetland ecosystems. And we saw, I think, from Mark's presentation, how just the restoring of a small parcel of land in one corner of Kenya has brought back a diversity of species that may have disappeared at some point. And I don't know about anyone in this house. I remember as a child, and I'm not very young, but I do remember as a child that when we drove with my father would see a lot of insects coming onto the carburetor. These days, I don't see it. I mean, and already there's a mass extinction of insects, and part of that loss is because of this loss of biodiversity. So how do we restore that, and how do we go back to what, or not necessarily back, as you've rightly said, Mark? I think the whole issue of restoring and restored, it's going to take a long time, and it's not a cheap affair. So I'm happy to really come to the conclusion, and thank you everybody who's been joining us online. You've been amazing. And for those joining us here in Nairobi, if you can give yourselves a round of applause. And a round of applause for the panelists, for the amazing panelists who are doing amazing things. Thank you very much. And for those of you who are out there, you are likely to join us in June, 22nd and 23rd of June in Bonn, when we have GLF Bonn. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day.